Everyone, how's it going? We're going to look at a worship song today because I put up that poll and y'all seem interesting. So let's give this a whirl. Let's see how this goes. If you like it, leave me feedback and let me know if you want to see this happen throughout the summer because I'm not going to do it forever. So maybe it'll just be a fun occasional summer thing. We'll do a couple songs here and there. How I'm going to do it, not too sure. So leave some ideas, in the comments about how you would like me to do it. Right now I have it this way. Who's the song to? What's the song about? What's the structure? What theological statements are made? Are they specific statements? Are they broad statements? What's the theological grade level I put this at? What is the song from my perspective, which is more subjective? What is the source? How does that affect the song? Things like that. I think another good question is, what is the interpretive from the congregation's point of view? Is this singable for the congregation? Because that's one thing that keeps coming up is that we see, worship songs that the congregation just can't sing. You have to be an amazing singer to sing it, which completely negates the whole point of corporate worship, right? So let's look at one of the first ones. It was repeated the most, and it's Waymaker. It came out, I think, in 2015. I didn't know about it until like a couple weeks ago. It's been covered a lot, like a lot. In fact, I saw someone on my story last week cover it. Right here we have the repeated phrases. I worship you is repeated 20 times. The chorus is repeated 6 times and the bridge is repeated twice. We'll get into these other highlights here in a second. So the first thing about repetition in itself is not bad. The Psalms use some repetition. Some people like to overplay the repetition, but it's usually like 2 to 3 times in prose to emphasize a point. And around that point is meat. There's a lot of theological meat behind those statements. And I think that's significantly different than what we're seeing here. And we'll get into that here in a minute. But repetition is not itself bad. And I can't help but think that whenever it's something like this, where I feel like it makes statements that aren't necessarily false, but it's not very deep. And we think about just like kind of making these proclamations over and over again. It feels almost like a Matthew 6 situation where, you had this mindless babble of the Gentiles to appease their gods to get them what they want. Some of that, I will admit, is from my analysis of who this came from, and we'll get into that in a second. But I'll tell you what, the reason why I got to who this came from is because of the repetition. Whenever I see a song with this much repetition, my first thought is, this probably came from a Word of Faith group. We'll get into that here in a second. But regardless, let's look at some of the other things I found. So I edited it to see, what the difference was if you cut out some of the repetition. And of course, as you can see, I left some of the repetition because if I just left one, I worship you, it'd be really cut down. So I was a little bit, merciful in that regard. With the standard edition, 263 words. The other one has 132 words. The edited version gets cut down quite a bit. I noticed that the shortest version is 5 minutes with some lyrics cut out, 3 minutes without lyrics. Full lyrics is about 7 to 8 minute average, but the longest one I saw was a 28-minute version of it. And I went through and I made sure, and I think there was only one prayer and it lasted for like 2 minutes. The rest of the song was 28 minutes. And how you sing this song for 28 minutes is beyond me. So let's look at the context. Let's look at the text and see what's going on. You are here moving in our midst. I worship you, I worship you. So you're here moving in our midst. So God is working in our midst. It's not false, it's just vague. And so, really, I don't know why we have to make such vague statements to where they just apply to wherever, whenever. I guess it's good to some extent. Now, when it comes to the I worship you, I'm not entirely sure why we have to say that so many times. The repetition of 20 times of that is kind of off-putting for me. I worship you, I worship you. Okay, let's talk more about God if we're going to use this as a worship song. How about we actually worship instead of talking about how we're going to do the worship? That's been a pet peeve of mine for a long time. There's a lot of songs that do that. Whenever we're talking about, This Is Our God by Sovereign Grace Music, they do say something like that. We will proclaim you're our God. They're saying that we will confess that you're our God. Let all the church sing praise. It's different than 20 repetitions of I will worship you. And I find that a little bit off-putting. But anyway, you're moving in our midst. You're working in this place. What this means actually comes to the context later. You're moving in our midst. You're working in our place. And so you're moving in our midst. moving in our midst, working in this place, repeated, and they're both shallow. They don't really say what's going on, and they move right into the chorus without telling you the context, and so you don't really know. Okay, he's moving in our midst. What's he doing? He's working in this place. What's he doing? He's a way maker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. So way maker is probably he makes a way to salvation, giving you the benefit of the doubt. Miracle worker, that could be. That's pretty straightforward. Promise keeper, okay, but what promises are you referring to? That's the theological question I automatically raise in a situation like this. Well, what promises are we talking about? A light in the darkness, okay, but what does that mean in your context? Because again, that's so theologically vague that it can mean a variety of things. And then it repeats, but it says, my God, that is who you are. So their God is, waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. Again, nothing that is necessarily bad if you view it from your theological framework. He's a waymaker. He makes the way to the Father through Christ. He's a miracle worker. He saves sinners. He's a promise keeper. He keeps his promises of soteriological promises. He's a light in the darkness. He's the light of the world. He's the light of mankind, right? Those are all true, but they're so vague that they're not meaningful. I think that there's just nothing of substance there. It's just words. I don't know how else to say that. You are here touching every heart. Now, assuming that this is a congregation that's singing the song, right? Because if it's a worship song, it'd be sung in a congregation. You're touching every heart. But that's not necessarily true. Is that a true statement that every heart is being touched by the ministry of the word or praise? No, not necessarily. You're healing every heart. Is that true? No, some people don't have that healing, and I think that's a big oversight to throw that big, wet, broad statement of every heart is being touched and every heart is being healed. And I think it comes from the source, and we'll get into that here in a second. You were here turning lives around. Again, very vague. What does that mean? That could, from one perspective, mean, yeah, you're bringing repentant sinners to grace. You are, showing you're growing the body, or it could mean, oh, hey, we went from poverty to prosperity, right? You're mending every heart. Same concept: touching, healing, mending every heart. Again, the blanket statement. If you hear this on K-Love, and if you're, a secular individual and you're listening to this, oh, he's touching every heart, healing every heart, mending every heart. No, that's not true. It's just not. And then it just repeats the chorus: waymaker, miracle worker, and that's the context, right? They're moving and working in this place, wherever this is sung. And again, this comes back from the source. Wherever this is sung, these things are happening. He's making a way, which doesn't necessarily mean Jesus is the way in this context, but he's making a way to turn our lives around, to mending every heart, touching every heart, right? Miracle worker, he's healing hearts, right? He's moving in that way. He's a promise keeper. Again, vague about what that even means. And here we go. Here you wipe away all tears. You mend the broken heart. You're the answer to it all, Jesus. Wipe away all tears. That's an eschatological reality. He's going to wipe away all tears. Awesome. You can affirm that. It's kind of vague, but I'll give it to them. You mend the broken heart, basically repeating here. So even here, the verse is just repeated in the chorus or in the bridge. And so you're the answer to it all, Jesus. The answer to what? Well, from what we know, turning our lives around, healing the heart, mending the heart. That's good. That's solid. And in the context of the song, I think that's solid. Then it repeats again, and you're here touching every life. You're meeting every need. Again, vague, and not everything is met. God is not your genie. And I think that again is kind of that mentality. So here's the kicker. So first off, where would I give this from a theological grade? I would probably give this a 6th grade theological rating. It's maybe that's even generous. This is something that a kid could sing. This is elementary maybe too as well. I can see a child singing this and being completely content. It's understandable to a child. It's not challenging for an adult at all. It's not engaging for an adult. It's engaging emotionally. The repetition, eventually you get sucked into the music. However the artist plays it, because I've heard it put with synthesizers and all these various instruments to evoke emotions, and it can become emotionally powerful. By the end of it, they're usually yelling, especially in the 28-minute version, man. They're just bolting, and then they repeat the last chorus like 2 or 3 times quietly. It's all about evoking emotions. And so that's kind of where that comes from. So in my view, is there anything inherently wrong with the song? I would say that touching every heart, healing every heart, and mending every heart is kind of a little bit iffy, but yeah, it's vague enough to pass a litmus test. It's vague enough to sing. Is it a worship song? It is directed to God. The emphasis on "I worship you" so much is a little bit off-putting, but the chorus focuses on God. I look at the chorus as kind of like the linchpin in the song. Where the chorus is directed, that's usually where I look at for in terms of whether or not it's a testimony song, whether or not it's a worship song. In some sense, it is a testimony song, but I would say just based on the chorus, I would go ahead and say it's a worship song. In terms of how I view it, I think it's sad. I think it's sad that we have this particular song. I mean, we're talking about cowboy chords too. Looked up the chords. So like F, G, A minor 7. Very basic structure, very basic song. And yet the singers that sing it go way beyond the congregational's range. And whenever I've heard it performed, it's like, I couldn't sing that. It's like, that's not something a congregation can sing along with, especially whenever the singer goes off and does their own thing. Worship is congregational. It's not about the singer on stage, period. And so the way that it's, expressed, the way that it's played, the basic structure, the repetitiveness, it's just not worthy of God. And I don't want to sound, this is my opinion, and I don't want to sound too critical, but whenever I think about music and someone's putting together a song that is supposed to be worshiping God, are you telling me you can't come up with anything better than this? You have to repeat "I worship you" 20 times in a song? Like, doesn't God deserve our best? Do everything for the glory of God, but this is the best we can come up with? That kind of bothers me. And it's kind of like, well, I can't think of anything else, God, so let's just slap this in here 20 times. That way we can throw it out there and get it produced and everything else. And it's catchy. I'll give it that. It's a catchy song. And that's what it has to be, because it has to be marketable. And that's kind of what it boils down to. You have secular producers producing these things and putting them out. And then you have covers, and it's all about, getting it played. It's an industry. That's what praise music has turned into. So I should have researched it after the fact. Next time I should look up the lyrics, look at nothing about the artist, and then do my assessment, and then come back and look at the artist, because my view on the artist did affect how I viewed the song. But the first thought I had was, this is very repetitive. This is probably a Word of Faith song. And that goes into the concept of repeating stuff is this positive affirmation. It brings things into existence, and how that's articulated is different in little ways. And whenever you look it up, sure enough, Christ Embassy, this is where the singer is a female, but she comes from this church with Pastor Chris. Checking out, the statements of faith, passes the smell test. It seems good. You watch some of their videos, it becomes very clear very fast that this is a Word of Faith church. He's a healing minister, television host, best-selling author. If you go to Give and you start looking at their giving categories, you have tithe, sow a special seed right there. They have other outreaches, daylight. So there are those other aspects. And then you get to their partnered website, Enter the Healing Schools with Pastor Chris, Prayer Network. It's the same stuff that you always see with Benny Hinn and with that crowd. And that's just what it boils down to. And so whenever you go back and you think in this context, you think of the context of, we need to evoke emotions, we need to move people, and we need to have that positive affirmation, that repetition, that confirmation that God is doing what we want him to do. All of a sudden the song makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So that's my assessment. Do you think it was fair? Do you think it was unfair? Do you think I should just delete this video because it was a wreck? I didn't talk about the other artists who sing it. But if you go look up this ministry, I mean, it becomes very clear that that's the cloth they're cut from. And I do get skeptical every time I see a lot of repetition like that. And the vague, shallow theology. They're just two signs that you're dealing with someone in that camp. And that doesn't mean that you can't have sound songs that are, shallow. You can, but it's a fine line. So yeah, that's my assessment. Let me know what you think in the comments, and that's it. God bless you all and have a wonderful day.